This episode of the My Latin Life podcast is brought to you by Language Blend, the new best way to learn Spanish. Language Blend focuses on what you actually need to live and get by abroad with daily one-on-one lessons, a dedicated texting partner. It's like living in a Spanish-speaking country without ever leaving home. Go to languageblend.com for more information. Welcome back to the My Latin Life podcast. Since 2014, My Latin Life has been your trusted guide to traveling and living in Latin America. My guest today is Niklas Anzinger. He's the GP of Infinita VC, a venture capital fund focused on startup cities, Prospera, and Latin America. Niklas, welcome. How's it going?
Great, and thank you for having me.
Yeah, absolutely. Where are you calling in from today?
I happen to be in Germany right now, but just for a couple of days to visit my family. Afterwards, I go to Zanzibar for 2 weeks, then to
Ooh,
New York for 2 weeks, and then back to Roatan, Honduras, and to Latin America.
that's quite a schedule.
Yeah.
What's up? What's going on in Zanzibar?
So we're going to talk about this later, but I'm particularly involved with Prospera, a startup city in Roatan, Honduras. And Zanzibar is doing some similar things. They have two new city projects. One is called Free Flow Eden, and another one is called Fumba Town. So they also do residential development there, technology development. The government of Zanzibar wants to become the next Singapore of Africa.
Wow, that's interesting. I hadn't heard about that before. Zanzibar is a pretty cool place to do it, I would think.
Yeah, similar to Roatan, just drop dead gorgeous places.
Wow, very cool. And so you're largely based in Prospera. You're a resident of Prospera, which is a sort of startup city in Honduras. Could you tell us a little bit more about this project and how you got involved? And actually, before we do that, I always love just mentioning the connection that the guests have to each other. And we, in the past, had a podcast episode with Thibaut Serlet talking about startup cities. So we've had one or two episodes talking about startup cities, Thibaut, and then also with Francisco Litvai, who you may know as well. So it's a topic that absolutely fascinates me, and we'll definitely be talking about startup cities on this episode. How's that sound?
Sounds great.
Sweet. So you're from Germany. How do we get over to Latin America and to Prospera in Honduras? Do you want to walk us through the story?
Yeah, so the story really starts in March 2020. I was working for a startup back in Berlin. I had a really cool life, but I was also feeling I was reaching the limits I wanted to achieve there, and I was starting to look for something new. And I was on a business trip in New York City, and I had my first date with who's now my wife. And we had a date like in the movie Before Sunrise. It was 24 hours long, and we couldn't let off of each other, and we're talking about our hopes and dreams and our visions for the future. And we already talked about that we wanted to go travel the world and be nomadic and do our own businesses. And the next morning, I went back to Berlin and she was in New York, and we were making plans to reunite in London and Barcelona. We even bought flight tickets. But it didn't happen because it was March 2020 and a global pandemic canceled all flights. But we just kept talking every day, and we were talking more concretely what we want to do and how. And we said, all right, so the first country that lets both of us in, that's where we'll go. We were going to start living the lives we want and go after the biggest possible dreams that we want to achieve in life. And that was 4.5 months later in Croatia. And ever since then, we've been traveling together. We got married 1.5 years later, started several businesses, including the one that I'm doing now. And also, very quickly after Croatia, a couple months later, we discovered Mexico, because Mexico is really easy to get in and out of. Originally, our plan was to go to Asia. We just ended up falling in love with Mexico and with Latin American culture. We spent a lot of time there. And from there, about 1.5 years later, I heard about Prospera for the first time on a blog called Astral Codex 10 by a very well known blogger by the name of Scott Alexander. So
Mhm.
he's very widely read in Silicon Valley and rationalist circles and among technologists. And And to take a step back, I was into startups and entrepreneurship, but before that, I was into economics and policy. And so I was really thinking about both dimensions, like the governance dimension, the legal system, the incentives, but then also sort of from the entrepreneurship side, what can you actually build or actually do? And one thing that I noticed during the pandemic, especially, and looking at the healthcare system and what it did and didn't do well, I just found it had terrible flaws in terms of how the incentives work. And I believe it's terribly overregulated, and that is causing a lot of the harm and preventing entrepreneurs, the science and technology we have,
Mhm.
from achieving much better health outcomes for us. So I think the incentives are systematically misaligned. But what can you do about it? I thought, right? So
Mhm.
you always have to kind of wiggle around the regulations and find something that you can do around them or in areas that aren't as regulated as like software. But like the big problems in life, like how to radically extend our lifespan, how to get energy too cheap to meter, how to get affordable housing, these things are in very regulated areas. So when I heard about Prospera for the first time, what fascinated me was the legal innovation. So what if we do regulation differently? What if we sort of advance or implement ideas that haven't been implemented before, such as property rights in three dimensions, including air rights, and have it like on the blockchain and have it things be governed by like smart contracts and things like that. So it was really fascinating. And Prospera, I read, really was pushing the frontier. But I also found that sounds too good to be true. I got to check that out and see that with my own eyes. So in April 2022, we organized a little conference there because I wanted to meet as many people as possible and thought that was a good reason for people to come, to bring their whole team, and for other entrepreneurs from other parts of the world to discover it with me or explore
Yeah,
it with me.
you've been running a lot of events.
Yeah, right. And it was all comes back to that first conference in April 2020. It was just an unforgettable experience. And it made me fall in love with the community there, with the people. And it made me also see there's already some really cool startups working there, like a gene therapy company, a construction tech company that's using robotic arms and 3D printing, a chartered bank with like open API access, and a drone logistics company. So I was like, wow, we're really building the future here. So I decided I want to be part of that. My idea was a VC fund to bring more startups to the starting line to disrupt all these industries that I was thinking about that basically need or desperately need change. And Eric Brimman, the CEO, said, yeah, I want to help you with this. How can we make it happen? And the rest is history. And since then, I'm running more events in Prospera to attract more entrepreneurs from Honduras, from other parts of Latin America, and from the rest of the world, especially from like very frontier tech oriented groups in the United States to come and see it for themselves and see it can upgrade their life or help them do things that they otherwise couldn't do.
Mhm. So Prospera is located on the island of Roatan in Honduras. Paint us a picture what Roatan looks like. What's the vibe? What's Prospera like? Are there buildings? What's going on?
Sure. So Roatan is an island about the size of Hong Kong. So it's big and it has a population of 70,000 people, which means it's relatively sparsely populated. It's more developed than mainland Honduras and it's actually quite safe. It's really safe. It has good roads, it has good infrastructure, it has a lot of tourist resorts, some of them quite luxurious, and it has a decent standard of living. The English is mostly English speaking because it used to be a British colony. So 60 to 80% of the people there speak really good English. And Prospera is a zone of about 1,000 acres. That's about the size of Monaco, right? And it also
Nice.
includes territory on mainland Honduras with access to a port.
Really?
And also what might be surprising or what the media paints extremely falsely is that it's not an enclave for rich internationals. Like 50 to 70% of people who are working there and living there are Hondurans, right? So these are both local workers from the island, from neighboring villages who are attracted by better jobs and higher wages, as well as educated Hondurans from the mainland, like who work in like technology or work as lawyers or are looking for white collar opportunities that aren't as much available in Honduras. And then there's a section of sort of international entrepreneurs like myself is a subsection of that. So, and how you can imagine that or picture that is it's basically divided into two. The Central Territory is basically divided into two. So one of them is a greenfield site, and in the greenfield site, there's a lot of construction. They're about to finish one big residential tower, which is where more than 100 people will move into, including me together with my wife. There's like a co-working space
Hmm.
where most of Prospera's staff are working. There is the Construction Tech Mini Factory, which is a really cool futuristic building, which is where construction materials are produced for other construction sites. And that's one side of the territory. It's very greenfield, very jungly, very much in the making. And then the other part of it, they bought ready made, right? So they bought a neighboring golf resort. And that golf resort is really luxurious. It's very beautiful. It has stunning views over the island. It has five-star restaurants, resorts, beach access, pool, and it looks really, really nice. So that is also now part of the Prospera jurisdiction and under Prospera law, and also land that's used for development to developing more things. So it likely won't remain a golf course.
Very cool. Well, at least for now, Prospera has its own private golf course.
Yeah, for now. And also to mention, it is a Caribbean island, but it has several advantages that it is protected from hurricanes. So it's outside of the zone of where hurricanes take place. The weather is amazing, right? Because it has both sun and sea breeze. So it isn't as scorching hot or humid as on mainland Honduras. So it has stunning weather. It's a scuba diving paradise. It's one of the best locations in
Hmm.
the world for scuba diving. And it has pretty cool bars and restaurants.
Hmm. Hmm. I'm sure a lot of people are thinking that. They're saying, why Honduras? What is the kind of melting pot of factors that's leading Prospera to being probably the startup city project in Latin America that I've been hearing the most about?
Yeah, so Honduras, it was an interesting history that started in 2009. So, a man, a Nobel Prize winning economist named Paul Romer, gave a TED talk about charter cities. And that was an opportunity that a man by the name of Octavio Sanchez and some other people that were close to the then president, in fact, he was his chief of his staff, used it as an opportunity to realize some of their own ideas about decentralizing governance in Honduras. Right? Honduras is a very poor country. It has a lot of crime, a lot of corruption. So the model or the idea of special economic zones to harbor these charter cities or new city developments was what made China rich. It's what caused the success of Dubai. And there is also remnants or inspirations of that model from the history of Hong Kong and of Singapore.
Right.
So that small team but of Honduran men that were part of the then government really initiated a legal process that ended up in a constitutional amendment that allowed these zones. So that means these zones are enshrined in the constitution and they have very strong legal protections and investment protections, which is exactly what you need because in countries like Honduras, investment security is one of the main concerns or the main reasons why foreign investment is not coming there, because they need that kind of certainty. So it was a long process that took 4 years until that legal framework was enshrined in the constitution. And then it took 4 more years for the first zones to be approved, which was not only Prospera, there's one more, two more actually, Ciudad Morazan, which is a charter city in Choloma on the mainland or close to Choloma. And another one is called Orquídea, that's more focused on agricultural production and development. So Honduras has a very interesting history with these zones. Right now, they have the legislation in the world for special economic zones with the highest degree of legal autonomy. Right.
Hmm.
So there are several features of these zones that make Honduran legislation really interesting just from a legal perspective and give zone developers a lot of options and flexibility. That's why Honduras became such a hotbed for these zones. But also to mention that 1.5 years ago, Honduras elected a far left government, which is right now hostile to these zones. So in Prospera, these zones, they have very strong legal protections, but right now that government is testing those a bit.
Yeah, that's fascinating. Yeah, I was very surprised when I had my podcast with Thibaut Serlet, our mutual friend, and he explained to me how many zones there really are. They go by different names. There's sort of different ways to package these things, or like different models out there. But there's something like 1,000 plus economic zones and startup cities and all these things around the world. It's quite extensive, and there's a lot more in Latin America than you might think.
Yeah, correct. So there's a proliferation of thousands of zones. They're especially common in Asia and in Africa and in many parts of Latin America as well. So Panama has a lot of them, Costa Rica, Uruguay. So the idea of these zones are it's like a legal fork from the system of the national country of the country that's just
Yeah.
extremely hard to change, right? Because it's just so entrenched and so complex. So you just do a fork that is connected, but is starting largely from a clean slate. So it's much easier to adopt changes or new models or test new things in on a small confined territory.
You know, I think what's cool about what you do, Niklas, is you're really sort of at the forefront of a couple different new concepts or movements that overlap in interesting ways. Like you talk about the network state, you talk about sort of traditional startups and venture capital. You talk, especially in a Latin American context. I think you're talking about healthcare a bit as well, and more so. I think you have plans to do more in healthcare. So I think what's really cool is how you're really one of these minds that's at the forefront of like what is a country, and if we were starting a country from scratch, if we really did like base principles, like how would we, maybe redo it. I think these a lot of these ideas around the nation state are going to get challenged in the next century, right?
Yeah, exactly. So that's actually also what Prospera did for me. Like that, very few people have the chance to get to experience a new jurisdiction setting up. So you get to see everything from a first principles basis, right? So how does it actually work when you have like a charter and you have laws that you voluntarily adopt? And how does it interoperate with like criminal law of the country, with immigration law? How does a business registry and corporate law actually work? And how can you write your own laws for that? So that's all really, really fascinating. And I'm getting the rare chance in history to experience that and learn sort of from a first principles perspective how that works. Similar when you're doing a startup, when you do everything from scratch, then you really know on a much deeper level what all these functions really do or are, like business development, sales, marketing, the technical side, because you see it all when it starts and when it grows bigger.
Hmm. And are people building software businesses at all in Honduras? And are you even still? Is that like one of the big focuses of Infinita VC? Is software business as part of it? Because I know when you were back in Germany, you were pretty involved in a couple SaaS businesses that have done well. And so, are you keeping up with SaaS stuff?
Yeah, so it's not the explicit focus of the fund, or a bit less, but it doesn't mean wouldn't invest in SaaS businesses. But they got to check a couple of other boxes for me. So why I'm really doing the fund and why I'm interested in it is sort of Prosper has a very innovative new idea on how to do business regulation, right? So the basic premise of the idea is it's not anymore that you have one regulator like the FDA or the FAA or the SEC, and because they're so centralized and sort of their what they decide affects so many people, that creates the wrong incentives. So what instead you can adopt to choose the regulation you want to be under as a business, and you have to convince an insurance company and you have to agree to binding arbitration. So the insurance company, in fact, becomes the regulator that assesses your risk. And based on whether or not what you do is very common
Hmm.
sense and tried and tested in other countries, they give you low premiums. And this is something very new and very innovative, then it gives you higher risk premiums. So I think that's a really awesome idea. So, and I think that especially relevant in industries that are extremely overregulated, where innovation is pretty stagnant. So the biggest ones for me are biotech and healthcare, and which each one of them I could talk for hours. hardware, sort of also housing and real estate, although that's not something I can invest in as a VC. And third, sort of on the financial side. So there's a lot of crypto business that's just not possible or taking too slow. Like, for example, tokenization of real world assets, just because of very rogue regulators like the SEC in the United States that's cracking down on crypto. So these industries, I think, have a particular advantage in Prospera. But that's mostly kind of for more international frontier technologists. That's one side of my fund, and the other side, or part of my mission, is I want to supercharge the Honduran startup ecosystem. Right, so Honduras has never received a single institutional VC investment in any startup. I've made the first one a couple of weeks ago, right,
Wow.
into a telehealth startup. So that's a bit less on the frontier tech side, but at the same time, an amazing startup. And I think they're doing it exactly right. And I've coached them for the last 12 months. And I'd love to see more Honduran tech startups. And they can be SaaS, they can be anything, as long as they think they get value out of what I do and potentially what Prosper can do for them.
Hey guys, quick break from the episode to tell you about BitRefill. BitRefill allows you to shop online and in person without banks, converting your crypto directly into merchant balance. We're talking gift cards to Nike, Amazon, Apple, Airbnb, Hotels.com, and many more, all paid for with crypto. BitRefill offers more than 10,000 gift card options in 180 countries, including the USA, Canada, all across Latin America, including Brazil, Colombia, Mexico, Argentina, El Salvador, and many more. You can also apply the code MyLatinLife at checkout to get 10% back on your first purchase. Go to bitrefill.com for more information.
So I was really the first one to go in there. I was the lead investor. I've been talking to them for more than 12 months. Initially, when I started to set up the fund, I did some customer research. I always do that when I do a new business. And I found out about them through like a Forbes something article, like the most interesting startups in Central America. So I talked to all of them, including them. And I also looked at a couple of dozens other Honduran startups. I invited many of them to the conferences. I met some of them in San Pedro Sula. I organized events there, and they were the best one that I've talked to. So, and but there's no very little in of a tech or a funding landscape, right? So the financing or funding conditions in Honduras are pretty bad. It's only pretty predatory financing options. And there's
Mm-hmm.
also very little kind of awareness of how to do kind of standard VC, right? So you got to do a Delaware C corp, and there's just some things that you need to be aware of, and that you've got to streamline in the right ways to be investable from a venture capital perspective. So it's
Mm-hmm.
basically teaching them all that, right? I was helping them set up a Delaware C corp. I was showing them how to do safe notes, which is kind of the main investment vehicle in VC, and I just help them set up everything so they're investable for VCs from any country from the world, from the United States or from other Latin American countries.
Mm-hmm. And Nicholas, how did you get your background in venture capital? How did you learn about this business model and decide to implement it in Latin America?
Yeah, it was a really not a common story, right? So most VCs either come from the financing side, have come from like private equity or investment banking, or they've worked for VCs before. Others have been entrepreneurs before with very large exits that then made a lot of money. I have neither. I'd always as an entrepreneur before, but I didn't have a large exit. I still have some shares in previous ventures, but they won't be super big exit. But they might be small-ish, nice. Um, but I had no background in VC, and the two things came together for me. One was Prospera, right? So that was just a really cool story, and there was already some evidence for some killer apps that we could build on top of the Prospera platform. So like a gene therapy company that's based there, and the construction tech, the drone company, the bank that I mentioned. So that's just a story that many people have been waiting for. There's kind of a scene, right? So Founders Fund, for example, 1517 Fund, these are VC funds in the United States that are focused really on frontier technologies that are experiencing kind of the regulatory bottlenecks firsthand. So there's a degree of awareness, and there's been kind of an intellectual movement for a couple of decades, starting with Patrick Friedman and the Seasteading Institute, that has been kind of paving the
Hmm.
way or blazing the trail for this idea of charter cities and sort of innovation zones for frontier technologies. But I was really among or the first one to really see, hey, this is happening and this is investable now. So just being the first one with that story, which is kind of a really exciting story, I think that made that was really helpful. And then I was also getting access to a really cool program for emerging VCs called VC Lab, right? So VC
Okay.
Lab really taught me the tools of VC and helped me sort of set up the legal structures and just gave me the tools to be a high quality VC fund manager. So I ended up doing it on my own, although I had initially had no idea what I was getting into. And it's certainly not the easiest thing in the world to start a VC fund without sort of prior experience or deep connections in VC or to that many rich people for that matter, right? Because VCs raise money from other investors, rich people typically, and sort of my network from my previous job didn't have that much of a high overlap with with that VC fund that I wanted to do. There's only one out of 20 investors in my VC fund I knew before. So I really had to create or craft a new persona, which is what I did through the events, through the a podcast that I have, a Stranded Technologies podcast, which got a very decent following in a short amount of time within that scene. So this is how I started a VC fund.
That's incredible. So where's the GP base from in terms of geography? Are they more European or from the Americas?
I'm a solo GP. It's just me.
Or sorry, LPs.
Oh, yeah, it's very wide net. So from the United States, from Germany, from Denmark, from Switzerland, in Latin America, from Guatemala. Right? So that's kind of a main. So one of the founders of Prospera is from Guatemala. So he was able to introduce me to a lot of people there that are very interested in what we're doing in Prospera. And there's also Universidad Francisco Moraquin, which is kind of a free market oriented university. So that's kind of also sort of aligned in spirit with what we do there, which is part of the attraction, and which is why I was able to build a network there.
Tell us a little bit about the healthcare opportunities and the businesses there in Central America and in Prospera. It sounds interesting. Where are they sourcing the talent from in terms of like the doctors and labs and scientists and stuff?
Mhm. Yeah, so in Prosper specifically, I think it could become Prosper's killer app just because it's so overregulated in other places and there's so many opportunities, so much science and technology that's not developed fast enough, but could be, right? So we have one cool company called MiniCircle that's doing gene therapy clinical trials together with a clinic called the GARM Clinic, which is a stem cell clinic, which is also an
Hmm.
overregulated area. And there's also a wellness center and clinic, and now a very experienced biotech entrepreneur from the United States is setting up a regenerative medicine hub. So he brought tons of American doctors, clinicians, and entrepreneurs to that want to now build their own clinics there, and yeah, so that's kind of the base that is there right now. There is not yet a hospital, right? So we're still talking about sort of small numbers and sort of initial early stage things that are going on, right? But when I think about healthcare as a whole in Latin America, I generally think it's a very big opportunity. Like 40% of healthcare in Latin America is private, right? A large part of the population is uninsured or doesn't have access to healthcare, and many people think that's not a good thing, that think public insurance or healthcare is a good idea. I don't think that's a good idea. So instead, sort of have a very lean private market with pay out of pocket options. That's exactly what that startup that I'm investing in Honduras is doing, right? So, it's just too cumbersome and too expensive and too bureaucratic to, it's just impossible to provide healthcare for something that people can afford without
Hmm.
sort of extracting higher taxes from them. And they're able to provide them with decent services for like $8 a month, right? So you have a doctor available through an app. So I think that's a much more elegant and leaner option than the several third parties and middlemen mess that we have in the public healthcare systems in the United States or in other parts of the developed world.
Hmm. And so would the target customer often be the United States for the companies based in based with Prospera?
Yeah, with the gene therapy clinical trials, yes. Right. So they are typically American that come visit to become participants in the trial. Right. So that is the target market. Also, when you think of sort of advanced longevity treatments in the future, they would be looking for a high paying segment that would be coming from the United States. Roatan has direct flights from Miami, from Houston, from Dallas, from Atlanta. So there is a base there. Medical tourism is quite a common thing. But at the
In
same
Roatan.
time, yeah, exactly.
Okay,
But at
cool.
the same time, what we're already doing with that startup that I invested is also provides much more affordable healthcare to people that right now can't afford it, right? So I think the Prosper has the potential to be delivering options to both a very high income segments of the population to get these treatments, but equally or as well or even better for a low income segment.
Like I know that Prospera was having problems recently with this new left government, and Prospera's like suing Honduras. Is that gonna get resolved, or is that a kind of a nothing burger, or how do we need to think about Prospera and its relationship with the Honduran government?
Yeah, so the Honduran government right now is very unpopular. So it's very likely that they're going to be voted out in 2 years. And that's really that's when we're really out of the trouble. But also if they're not able to achieve anything this year, they probably can't do much about Prospera, right? Governments typically get things done in the first year. And they've been trying to meddle with Prospera. They've been meddling with the banking system. They've done very harmful rhetoric. They've been meddling with customs, but they weren't able to undo Prospera because it has very strong legal stability guarantees. And the lawsuit against the Honduran government is basically a deterrence or an assurance, hey, we have these rights and we're going to defend them. So stop meddling with us, right? So nobody believes that they actually will or should pay that much. So this is kind of more of a deterrence, or I shouldn't say too much about that, right? So it's the intention is kind of to defend the rights that Prospera has legally acquired, right? So the investors have invested in Prospera because they had constitutionally guaranteed
Hmm.
investor stability, right? And you can't come in as a new government and just renege on these promises. This would be very harmful for Honduras as a country because who's going to invest in the future in Honduras, right? If any of these, if even such strong investment guarantees that have been assured through a constitutional amendment get trampled on just like that. So it's very important for the future of Honduras, I think, that Prosper succeeds and
Hmm.
that the country will remain open for foreign investment, right? Because how else would you develop as a country? Honduras is a very poor country.
But it's pretty cool that it's able to keep running and staying alive in despite of a government that's slightly hostile to it.
Yeah, I agree. So Prosper has made continuous progress despite a hostile government, right? And imagine how much it's unleashing or taking off without that government, right? So there's still continuously new people coming, and we're building and developing new things. So there will be even more of that once that's out. To your question, the right relations with government, that's a very hard one. So people have been trying for decades to make more projects like that happen, and it hasn't happened for a very long time. So there's
Hmm.
really a lot of eyes of hope on Prospera for it to work, right? So that is then setting a model for the future. We've never in history really come that far in pushing the boundaries to sort of develop some of these new legal ideas and things that are happening, the legislation there. So it's
Hmm.
be very important for it to sustain itself. But at the same time, I'm already seeing lots of inspiration from Prospera in other parts of the world.
Hmm.
So I don't think the government in Zanzibar was directly influenced by Prospera, but definitely two of the projects that we're working with, they come from the Charter City movement. They have been looking very closely what we're doing. We're sharing legal templates. Same in Montenegro. So Vitalik Buterin was organizing kind of a pop-up village. And there's a
Hmm.
new government in power in Montenegro, and they're negotiating with them as well to get special economic zones, also focused on healthcare and on biotech. And we're just sharing the same sort of legal language and drafts, right? Similar to the country of Mauritius. And we want to do more of that in other parts of Latin America as well. So we know that Uruguay is known for very good governance and they have special economic zones. So we
Hmm.
want to also go there with a group of people and see how much more we could get if we get similar deals, similar in Panama and in Costa Rica, also broadly known for good governance, and they have many special economic zones. So I think it's definitely a model for the future in terms of how the legal setup allowed sort of what's kind of an effective subdivision of Honduras. You can imagine it like a municipality with very
Hmm.
strong legal autonomy, right? So I think that's definitely a model for the future for other places in the world.
Hmm. And Nicholas, you mentioned the Charter City movement. How organized is this movement? How many people are involved? Who are some of the biggest proponents of this right now?
Yeah, sure. So the Charter Cities Institute is probably the most well-known institution in that space. The chairman, former CEO Mark Lutter, is a friend of mine who's also been on my podcast. So, who's very well known or associated with that is Yinoluwa Aboyeji, for example. He is the biggest African tech entrepreneur, sort of
Okay.
Avandela and Flutterwave, two out of I think 10 African unicorns, who's now started Itana, which is the starter city in Nigeria. So these are prominent proponents. Previous proponents have included Sam Altman, now
Yep.
OpenAI, who has previously supported charter cities. Mark Andreessen has talked about charter cities in the past. George Mason University economists such as Tyler Cowen or Alex Tabarrok have talked about charter cities a lot in the past. The Free Cities Foundation is another player in that space and is putting out a lot of content or has developed parts of the model of free cities.
Hmm.
So I think that encapsulates the spells. Peter Thiel, of course, has been a supporter of the Seasteading Institute and Patrick Friedman. So, and that's also associated with Naval Ravikant, Balaji Srinivasan, who are also involved in the space. Balaji Srinivasan, especially with the network state.
Hmm. That's cool that you're kind of brushing up on some of these guys. I was perusing your podcast, and the guests that you have are very interesting. And it's almost like a more academic side of this idea of sovereignty and smart cities and charter cities and all this stuff. And yeah, really cool. So you're up to like 60 episodes now almost. What are some of the most notable episodes that you think people should check out, or the most sort of emblematic of what you're trying to achieve?
Yeah, so I think one that was really a big aha moment for me and for many other people that I showed this to is episode 7 with Tom W. Bell, right?
Okay.
So I call Tom W. Bell the Satoshi Nakamoto of innovative legal systems. Right? She's literally written an open source legal system that's on GitHub. And that's the basis for Prospera and another special jurisdiction called the Catawba Digital Economic Zone. So that's probably a closer analogy to what you mean by a fork, right? So you can take that code base and then fork it to
Hmm.
Prospera and adopt it with like local flavors and laws and things like that. So that's one. I would say Patrick Friedman, episode 32, is also a good one because he's one of the main pioneers or originators of that idea space. So he
Hmm.
encapsulates a lot. And also episode, I think it's 20 or 21, with Jay Storrs Hall, who has a fantastic book called Where is My Flying Car, which is sort of a bit like a Bible for us in Prospera and sort of talking about everything that we want to achieve in terms of all the technological development that is held back by
Hmm.
bad political incentives and by overregulation, and how much of it we could have, like through nanotechnology or nuclear power and longevity biotech and things like that, if we chose a better legal approach, if we chose to be less on the sort of safetyism, precautionary principle side, but instead are willing to let young people and entrepreneurs take risks on behalf of the rest of society.
That's awesome. And as a fellow podcaster, obviously, I can appreciate the very diverse and interesting group of guests that you've assembled for your podcast. Again, guys, you can check it out. It's called the Stranded Technologies Podcast. It's on Spotify. It's everywhere. So, Stranded Technologies Podcast. So go check that out. one of the episodes that you said was most notable was the Patrick Friedman episode, founder of the Seasteading Institute. Nicholas, for people that are unfamiliar, could you explain to us what the Seasteading Institute is? And earlier you referenced that it had a really big influential impact on the startup cities and stuff that we're seeing now. And would love if you could kind of explain that.
Yeah, so the idea is, what if governments, or what governments provide as a service called governance, was like a product, right?
Uh huh.
So that you pay for in the form of taxes, right? So you have subscription fees with a very high lock-in and very high barriers to entry. You typically have local monopolies that
Hmm.
work with each other like cartels,
Hmm.
right? So they have like international tax treaties and things like that. So they don't like you to they don't like to have competition, right? So that's why they co-opt each other.
Hmm.
And it's these governments or nation states pretty much do exactly what Econ 101 predicts, right? So they have low customer satisfaction, the service quality is declining while the cost is increasing, right? So that's pretty much happening with governments all over the world. Many of which are also really terrible providers, sort of in many Latin American countries or in African countries, where people really suffer from it as a result.
Hmm.
So, what if you could, looking at the history of what if you could develop a new product, right? If you could compete with them like a startup, right? So that was kind of the original idea of seasteading. Governments control all the land in the world. So let's go to the ocean and sort of create seasteads, right? That we can, under the law of international waters, govern under a new set of ideas instead of do
Hmm.
it better than existing governance and compete. There were challenges with that idea, mainly cost, right? It's very hard to build a technology that's lasting on the water at affordable prices. And also, the legal situation isn't as good as initially thought. So instead, seasteading pivoted to the charter cities model, right? And the idea was, let's work together with governments, with like public-private partnerships through the special economic zone model. It's because that model is like very well proven. It made China into a wealthy country. It worked in Dubai, and there's a similar set of circumstances that made Singapore and Hong Kong go become very wealthy very fast through common law based approaches. So the
Hmm.
common law is really key to make Prospera, to make charter cities work. And
Hmm.
that recent
Okay, so you're
iteration of that
using
idea,
common law, not
yeah,
civil
yeah,
law
yeah,
in Prospera.
exactly. So,
Okay,
mm,
cool. Hey, dude, I wanted to stop you. I had a question.
mm.
Um, so the Seasteading Institute, I don't know why in my mind, it also makes me think of Sealand, which was the or is a unrecognized micronation project where it's like a abandoned oil rig off the coast of somewhere
Rose
in
Island?
Europe. You know what I'm talking about?
You mean Rose Island?
I haven't heard that term, but it's called Sealand, like SEA land, Sealand.
Okay.
And for
I
some
know of Rose
reasons in my
Island, which had
head,
a very cool
Ro-
Netflix film movie made about it.
no, which one's that? Ross Island?
Rose Island,
Rose
ROSE Island.
Island.
Yeah, it was off of the
ROSE
coast
Island.
of Italy somewhere. Really cool
Republic
movie.
of Rose Island. Dude, okay, yeah, yeah, okay. So this is like a very this seems to be I'm just looking at Wikipedia, an extremely similar idea. Um and maybe this was like the original inspiration. There's a documentary about this?
Yeah, yeah, it's on Netflix.
Okay. Big recommendation. I'll be checking that out. But Seasteading Institute has nothing to do with Sealand or any of these man-made platforms in
I
the
mean, it
ocean.
might have adjacently. I mean, what came before studying the Seasteading Institute, there was a history of several attempts at like several micronations and some of
Hmm.
these stats on water as well, right? So that's kind of been capturing the human imagination, at least since Ayn Rand's Atlas Shrugged. And before that, there was also a history of people founding new cities or exploring like the new world or new frontiers.
Hmm.
So I think it's very much a part of human history. But I think with seasteading, especially, it became or started becoming kind of a more serious movement, right?
Hmm.
And that now with the Charter City Institute is now sort of having the credibility and the talent and the capital to have several projects going on around the world that are funded professionally and that are a bit more than what used to be, as far as I know, pretty ragtag groups, right? So if you want to
Hmm.
talk to Thibaut again, he can tell you all about sort of the several failed attempts, like from the 60s and 70s onwards, that didn't often
The
end well.
history. Hey, everybody. Hey, everybody. Quick break from the podcast to tell you about Language Blend, the best new way to learn Spanish. Language Blend was co founded by Jake Nomada, friend of the podcast, decade of experience in Latin America. And Jake and his team, they put everything into this program that they wish they had in terms of how to level up quickly with your Spanish language skills. Because the faster that you can get conversationally fluent in Spanish, the better the experience that you're going to have in Latin America. So go to languageblend.com for more information. It's fascinating because I think everyone has a little bit in them where they want to found a country and be a pioneer like that. And it's cool to sort of go into the history of how the intellectual approach to this has evolved since the 60s and 70s to now. And now it's like a whole different thing when you can layer on crypto and smart contracts and all this other stuff.
Yeah, exactly. So that's the idea behind it, and I think it's an idea that time has come. And now we're at an inflection point with several successful projects, including Prospera. And now
Hmm.
we really know how it works, and we have like a degree of professionalism and experience that allows us to do this more often. So I think this is a particular interesting time, and I want to see more of that happening and sort of supercharge that movement with my VC fund and invite other people who are interested in that to join as well. I think we couldn't have chosen a better launch pad than Roatan, than Honduras, and Latin America in general.
Yeah, that's amazing. Have you been getting into scuba diving while you're there?
Yeah, I got into scuba diving before in Mexico.
That's sick. Do you have some of the PADI certificates?
Yeah, I got open water and advanced scuba diver, and Roatan is gorgeous for that. It has the second largest barrier reef in the world. So it's really got its own like Grand Canyon underwater. So we have a scuba shop there where you can pay in crypto as well. So that's super cool there.
What about boats? Do boats have any piece of the puzzle here, either just personally for people living on Roatan, or maybe in a more strategic purpose as part of the smart cities and stuff?
Yeah, probably not a dimension that I see immediately on the strategic side. So you have to be aware the coral reef is, it's inherently valuable, so it should be very strongly protected so that it doesn't invite for a lot of marine traffic.
Hmm.
If at all, it has too much marine traffic from cruise ships, right? So it's economically a good opportunity, but I'm a bit questioning that from an environmental point of view. But Rotan has that independently of Prospera. They don't have anything to do with that. So, but other than that, for personal use, there's several really cool bays and bites where sort of close to shore. It's definitely pretty cool to drive around with the boat, and I can imagine myself sort of building my own house by the water and like having a boat and driving from place to place on the island.
I believe it because I think boats bring a new aspect of freedom, and especially in the Caribbean, like to be able to rip around, maybe head up to Belize, head down to
Yeah.
Panama or
We
something.
have
That'd
the
be cool.
port access on the mainland Honduras that I mentioned before, right in La Ceiba. So maybe
Yep.
that could be a hub for that. In fact, we have drone logistics, so we can transfer things between here and there. And for the next construction tech conference in September 8 to 10, I've even invited a startup that's doing jetpacks.
I love it. Hopefully, by we can get by jetpack from Les Seba to Roatan.
Exactly. And then from there, we can go into our boats, and from there, we can go to Belize or wherever.
I love it. Can we talk about residency a bit? I guess for Honduras, and then I think Prospera also has its own form of residency or e-residency. Could you break down what the options are if someone wants to move down there or to set up a base?
Sure. Yeah, the easiest way to get started is just to join the Circle community. So it's a new platform that's called community.prospera.co. So this way you can very quickly get to know the community. And then the first tier of residency is e-residency, so same as Estonia, that allows you to form businesses and LLCs in Prospera, and you
Hmm.
can do it remotely as a nomad. And then you can also become a full resident. So I'm becoming a full resident. I'm in the process of it, but it's a bit less easy. So I also have to become a Honduran resident to get full Prosper residency. Full Prosper
Really?
residency is very attractive because it's very low taxes. It's a 5% income tax and it's only territorial, 2.5% value added tax, 1% revenue tax, but all just territorial. So that's a
Hmm.
very attractive tax setup. So I want to have my tax residency there. And to get Honduran residency is not as hard as in many other countries, right? So it costs something in the lower thousands to a lawyer. There's several options, and it takes 3 to 6 months. So it's not impossible.
So, do you recommend that people get the Prospera residency first or get a standard Honduras residency first?
First, you get the Honduran residency because the Prosper residency is no problem at all, right? That's the easiest thing. So the Honduran residency is the bottleneck.
Okay, cool. Do you have a recommended path for people? I know that there's a couple options.
Yeah, I mean, it's pretty much it. So there's a couple of lawyers that I can recommend if you message me privately in one of the chats. So that do it for you, right? So they help you get all the documentation together. So that's what I would recommend if you're interested. But I would first just check it out and visit it, right?
Hmm.
So I know what I'm saying here. I know how I sound. Like I wouldn't have believed myself or come become a resident right away if I heard myself speaking. So I just recommend to experience it for the first time, just like I did with the first conference, because I'm organizing several conferences, right? So if you go to my website on the events site, I'm doing at least 4 more events this year, potentially 6,
Hmm.
right? So focused on construction tech and crypto and health and on biotech. So that's the best way just to experience what it is like there, to meet the community. And really, the community is what drives it all home for me. This is what I fell in love with. I made terrific friends there, and there's like a spirit that we're aligned in a big life changing mission. So, if you want to become a part of that, I highly recommend that you visit. And from there, we can help you with sort of options to obtain residency and do more there.
Yeah. Yeah. Tell us a bit about this community. What type of person would be a good fit for the Prospera community?
Yeah, yeah. So, what I think Prospect does really well, which is why I think that it was very successful so far, is there's a lot of local Hondurans that are involved, right? So 65% of residents are Honduran. These are divided into two. One is local service workers, and the
Hmm.
other is educated Hondurans from the mainland. There's hundreds of thousands of Hondurans leaving the country for the United States each year, and they can now come to Prosper instead, right? So if they're looking for opportunities. So that's kind of a base for the community. And many of my best friends are really from that Honduran community. They're super cool people. They're working there as lawyers, as entrepreneurs, and they just have a fire in them to be on this mission and lift their country out of poverty in the process. And the rest is an international community. I would say the most common use case is the one like myself. I'm interested in these frontier technologies.
Hmm.
Others are like in gene therapy and biotech or in the hardware stuff that we talked about. They're not necessarily always moving there. So they typically stay there like 2 to 3 months. And the rest they stay in like Austin or in Mexico or in London. And they come there to do work on their startups, and they're still part of the community that come to do for conferences, and they're very much part of the community. So you don't necessarily have to like move there full time. So like that frontier spirit and wanting to do like a really ambitious business and be part of that kind of community which wants to achieve great things, I think that should be the motivating factor for you to move there. There's also, of course, a use case if you're a bit older and wealthier. It's not a tax haven. There's much better options for that. But if you want to support young businesses and startups founders while having a great Caribbean life there, that's also a good use case for you to join.
Yeah, absolutely. And I,
But
I
nothing could
imagine
be
that
further
the high
from the
season.
yeah. But
Go ahead.
just to drive that message home, nothing could be further from the truth than what's often a false media narrative that it's like an enclave for rich people. Right? So it's mostly young entrepreneurs like myself and the Hondurans and sort of the service workers, and that's kind of the main constituents.
Yeah, yeah, I'd actually love to hear that breakdown because in my mind, it's a backpacking hub and scuba bums, basically. But I was speaking to a lawyer in the country maybe a month ago, and they said that it could become one of the most high barrier to entry islands in the Americas where like everyone's a millionaire and they're just, chilling on the island, protected, and how it could become like a cool millionaire's island. So kind of two extremes.
Yeah, I mean, I hope that it can reverberate in the rest of the world, right? I mean, I'm in this to achieve big things, and I also want to become wealthy in the process, but I don't want that to be an exclusive enclave. I think it would be worth doing, or what I want to achieve is that it can be a model to lift people out of poverty and to achieve economic development that's
Hmm.
used or emulated elsewhere in the world, right?
Yeah, that's amazing. So what's the plan for the VC fund?
Yeah, so I'm almost done with raising my first fund. In fact, I'm oversubscribed now. I'm still raising for a couple more weeks. I've already made the first 10 investments. I'm planning to do at least 15 more of them. And then on to new horizons and raise a second, bigger fund on top of the success of the first one. So,
That's amazing. And is
yeah.
it all seed stage or a mix of
Yeah,
stages?
so it's pre-seed and seed. So I do small checks, so 50 to 100K. So that means I'm typically a follow-on and I'm wanted on cap table as a strategic investor, right? So I'm especially attracted, of course, as the startup needs me and the access that I can give to places like Prospera and to that emerging space, right? So I don't require founders to use it. It's up to them. I just want to provide an option that can supercharge startups in some of these spaces. And that's and the other use case is Honduras, right? They are much more hands-on and in helping local technology startups. So, and I want to do more of that, right? So I see Prosper as my base. I plan to spend at least half of the year there, and I think it's also the most important project, which I want to focus like at least 70 to 80% of my time there. But I'm also already, that's why I'm going to Zanzibar, working with more projects and trying to make sure that what we learned there is known and used in other parts of the world so we can make this a bigger movement. Because I think we can succeed only if we become a bigger movement that comes in different flavors, that is trying a lot of different things. Because in the end, it's all about competition, right? And I think we can only do
Hmm.
it better if we remain a competitive market. And just as Latin America is for many of your listeners, it's just a better option than what you experience in many other parts of the world. So if we increase that competition for like the talent that's mobile, right, that I think is a very good thing for the world.
Good. So you think you caught the Latin America bug?
Oh, for sure. Yeah, that was even before when I was in Mexico. I was like there for a year, and I was like, oh my god, this is so amazing.
It's pretty different from Germany.
Yeah, but Mexico City, man, I just love it. It's so affordable. It's such good food, such nice people. There's also an emerging kind of startup and tech scene, and it was
Definitely.
so beautiful, the city. And we traveled outside many times to Chiapas, to Oaxaca, to the Yucatan, and just all these nice cities with all these pyramids, all this history, like the silver mines, the mount. There's so much in Mexico. It's such a kaleidoscopic place with so many just riches to see and experience.
You mentioned competition in terms of jurisdictions and startup spaces. What are the projects that you see right now that get you the most excited? What are some cool projects or communities or startup cities or charter cities or whatever that people should have their eye on?
Yeah, I mean, there's a plurality of different options, right? Sort of in the charter city space, Prosper is definitely the most advanced. I think Ciudad Morazan, also in Honduras, is really amazing because they're really proving the points that sort of liberty works for poor people, right? So they're starting with the poorest of the poor and basically making a gated community with basic security services affordable to poor people in one of the most dangerous parts of the country. So
Hmm.
that's also really well worth a visit if you're a nomad, right? And beyond that, I think the charter cities in Africa are really cool. So in Zanzibar, Free Flow Eden and Fumba Town, There's a really cool place in Zambia called Nkwashi, and there's two zones in Nigeria. They're very interesting. Beyond that, there's also kind of the network state idea, which is kind of a more
Mhm.
community first approach. So the best examples there would be Afropolitan and Praxis. So they're kind of cloud nations, but they're already negotiating with governments to also get physical territory to then eventually build cities. And the third tier is, or the third vector, the third vertical is co-living communities, right? So
Yes,
Serena is kind of a nomad community now. And there's other projects that are more in the network city or network state space that also kind of use Web3 for co-ownership and like build the places together and things like that. So I think Cabin is a fantastic example of that, which is has started in Austin, but is like a also like a franchise model where there's now communities in Puerto Rico, in Colombia, that are also kind of part of the network. And you have
it's
like
called
Citizen
Cabin.
and if yeah, cabin dot
Cabin.
city. So it
Cabin
also
dot
has like
city.
Citizen
Interesting.
NFT passes and stuff like that. So I think that's definitely a big and important part of the movement that's especially attractive
Is it
probably to
double
your
N?
audience. CABIN dot city.
No city. Okay, okay. I haven't heard about this. I'll take a look.
Yeah, so I think that's very attractive for your audience.
Network
I
city
stayed in
that
some of their
connects
cabins
people to
and
co-living. I'm glad you're making the
exactly.
connection about co-living and yeah, co-living in general because that's a movement that we're also tracking carefully. Buddies with Gonzalo Hall, who's been doing some co-living stuff in Portugal. Maybe you saw a bit of that on Twitter. And I think that all these things are very overlapped, as you seem to have noticed as well. Like co-living to the network state, it's funny. It's like where's the line between like roommates in a country, and it's like kind of blurring. It's crazy.
Yeah, correct. I, in fact, did once created a map that's sort of bundling all these different projects on like one, yeah, on let's look at one big startup like map. So I can send you that. That would be cool for your audience as well. That includes also the co-living trend.
Yeah. So you must be big on this idea that countries or jurisdictions are going to have to start competing for citizens and that a lot of the negotiating power is moving into the hands of the citizen, of the sovereign individual, someone that makes money online to basically choose the jurisdiction where, go where you're treated best and choose the jurisdiction that's most suited for your business and your lifestyle and basically just kind of have your pick among the thousands of charter cities and hundreds or thousands of jurisdictions that are out there.
Yeah, who would have thought that competition makes things better, gives you richer options at cheaper, more affordable prices?
I like that. That's a pretty simple solution because it's something that I don't know, like the nation state idea, countries kind of do compete, but they kind of compete against each other. But now they have to compete against each other for us and for the citizens. We're just more mobile than ever.
Yeah, and also they're trying to undermine competition, right? So they're forming cartels, which kind of say, oh, there's these international tax obligations. So they're kind of reducing the incentive for you to move. Something like double taxation, if you're an American, is doing that in especially vile and perfidious way, right? And so it's mostly like smaller countries like Palau or Estonia or to some degree Portugal that are kind of fishing on the margins, right? Because right now it's kind of the world is pretty divided up. I think what's adding a lot to that is border restrictions, right? So that is basically saying, well, people can't move freely, or if so, at just very high costs for untold millions, especially from like Africa or from Latin America as well to the north. That means, often at the cost or at the risk of death at some of these borders, right? So that's just very high switching costs and not a real competition, which is very frustrating, which is why it needs these new options because there's hundreds of millions of people who would not only digital nomads with the riches, but like poor people who want to go to a place with opportunity. So I think that's really where the big trend needs to go towards that we have more fluid borders and more competition for people that want to improve their life.
Hey guys, quick interruption to tell you about BitRefill. BitRefill is the best way to convert your crypto into gift card balances. These are gift cards that you can spend at hotels.com, Airbnb, Nike, and many more. You may remember Joel Valenzuela, previous podcast guest. He's been living on crypto exclusively since 2015, and he's a big consumer of BitRefill. And so I asked Joel, I said, what do you like most about BitRefill? He said that he likes the instant delivery, the precise amounts so that you don't have to juggle a lot of gift cards, and he loves the global selection. Nobody else has this much selection of gift cards, over 10,000 gift card options across hundreds of countries. Go to bitrefill.com to sign up, and you can also use the code MyLatinLife for 10% back off your first purchase. Go to bitrefill.com for more information.
There's just so much you learn once you go nomadic, right? So on the school and education side, I learned so much now, not only about homeschooling, but just generally make it more flexible, combine it with online, combine it with local options. And Prospera, we have Montessori school. So I just love the idea of educating my children there with all these flexible options that are nomad friendly. Same for insurance. It's just, much better options in healthcare. I just would not ever go to the United States or Germany again to do my healthcare if I can do it in Mexico. And same as with marriage, right? So the marriage arbitrage is captured by Denmark because my wife is American and I'm German. And for international couples, it's hard to marry in these countries because they don't, foreigners and visas and this and that. Utah is capturing now that market with the Zoom marriages. So there's just so much to optimize your life on, right? So now, of course, I'm going very much into I have bank accounts in multiple countries, business accounts in multiple countries, and just set up my life for my life to be unbundled and have like the sovereignty or sovereign individual stack that consists not only of having some of these options for education, healthcare, or business, but also communities, right? So I think a big part of the reason why people are not moving or that constitutes the barriers to entries is lack of community of cultural acclimatization, right? So people typically immigrate only once they already know people, right? So there's a particularly frontier or early adopter spirit that go first and then bring others, but most people don't do that. So I think part also of your sovereign individual stack is also great communities, sort of having a hub, for example, in Mexico in Roatan, where I just know people and I know people care about me, and through people I have access to the culture there and to options for my life, to schools and to this and that. So that is definitely something that I didn't consciously even think about doing when I started to become a nomad, but just opened my eyes in so many ways and just made me gravitate towards what I'm doing now and just unbundling my life in so meaningful ways. And I think charter cities or startup cities are really the newest frontier on that front, right? So to develop a richer or more flexible citizen stack that gives you just a much higher range of opportunity to be mobile and to be in different places around the world and to go where you want to improve your life.
That's incredible, Niklas. Thank you for sharing that. And thank you for everything that you're doing for the Prospera community and for venture capital in Latin America. So, again, my guest today was Niklas Anzinger, GP of Infinita Venture Capital, a fund based in Prospera, Roatan, Honduras. Again, this is another episode of the My Latin Life podcast. Thanks, everyone, for listening.